All right, well, I think we can go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for being here today. For those who I have not met yet, my name is Gianna Calabrese, and I'm a program coordinator with Peer Assistance Services. Before I introduce our presenter today, I'm just going to go over a couple of quick housekeeping items. So just so you all know, today's session will be recorded. So please keep your mics on mute for now, unless you need to ask a question later on. We are hoping to hold off on questions until we get to some interactive points within the LCS today, and then we'll have more time for questions at the end. If you feel comfortable putting your video camera on, we'd love to see you all, but no worries if not. And at the end of today's session, we'll just have you complete a post survey, which I will link to. So now I can introduce our presenter. So welcome, Sam Borden. Sam is our presenter today, and she is an SBIRT facilitator who provides training and technical assistance at Peer Assistance Services. Prior to working with Peer, Sam worked at an AIDS service organization where she managed a syringe access program. In addition to HIV, hepatitis C, and community education programs. Sam also provided direct service harm reduction to individuals in Northern Colorado, launched a statewide overdose prevention program, and continues to engage in policy and advocacy work with the Colorado Harm Reduction Champions. She also continues to provide harm reduction and drug policy education in a variety of settings, including mental health agencies, high schools, and universities. So welcome, Sam. I will turn it over to you.
All right, thanks, Gianna. So like Gianna said, I have spent a fair amount of my professional career in prevention and harm reduction. But I'm also passionate about this work because I am a person in recovery. And when I was a young person, my understanding of substance use was very, very black and white. I had a parent who was in active, turbulent addiction, and I had another parent who completely eschewed substances for that reason. I also was exposed to a lot of DARE when I was in school. And so the world around me was kind of saying, just say no, or else. There was no other options behind that door. And so I was a little bit petrified of substances, which worked for a while to keep me from engaging. But because of a number of biopsychological and social reasons, I did start to engage in substance use. And for me, it escalated rapidly. And I did not have a lot of avenues to reduce harm or to exit the cycle of isolation and danger that I had entered. Luckily, I did find my way to recovery. And it kind of put me in a position where I wondered what sort of things could have happened along the continuum of my substance use and the substance use of the people that I love and I care about, to kind of mitigate not only substance use itself, but some of the harms that can be associated. And so I really want to emphasize this as something that we can talk about at any age, and kind of incorporate it into our value system. We continue to lose the people we love, not only to addiction, but to harms that occur anywhere along that continuum of substance use. And so I want to make sure that we're providing tools to kind of deal with that, depending upon each individual. I also go into this knowing that you all are likely implementing a lot of these strategies already, and I want to acknowledge that. Hopefully, we're going to have some time to discuss some of the strategies that are working for you, some of the strategies that are causing some challenges, and just kind of pick each other's brains on how to best proceed with really encouraging this philosophy of practice that enhances safety for everyone. So we have a couple of learning objectives today. I'd like for you all to be able to describe some of the principles of harm reduction in relation to adolescent substance use. I would like for you all to feel like you can identify some strategies for reducing harm and integrating harm reduction into conversations about substance use. And then we'll also have an opportunity to discuss, like I said, the applicability of harm reduction in your practice settings. So before we get started, I'm going to have Gianna launch a poll. And this poll is just going to ask what your comfort level is with harm reduction, because I'm just curious to kind of get a feel for where you all are starting from.
Give it about 15 more seconds for folks to answer the poll.
And it's anonymous, so never fear. No one's here to judge you.
All right, looks like we got everyone. I'm gonna end the poll now. And can you see the results, Sam?
I cannot. You'll have to give me the play-by-play.
Okay, so the majority said, I'm not sure. It was about 43%. About 31% said, I'm pretty comfortable. A couple said they're a harm reduction champion, which is great. And then we had a couple folks saying they were still a little bit uncomfortable or that they may not feel comfortable at all.
Fantastic. So I'm glad that we have a diversity of comfort levels and experiences. Those champions, I would love to hear from you. And for those of you who are, feeling unsure or just kind of getting started out, I want to hear from you as well. And maybe as we go along, you're going to recognize that you've already been engaging in some harm reduction as you've been practicing. So let's dive in. So in the chat box, I'm going to have you all type something, but I don't want you to press send until I tell you to. And I want you to just list one example you can think of harm reduction. It doesn't have to be related to substance use. It can be anything that you know to be harm reduction. So go ahead and type in the chat, and I'll give you a couple seconds to do that. You don't have to think too hard, I promise. All right. So if you're ready, go ahead and press enter, and I'm excited to see what we got. Awesome. So we have condoms, absolutely. Bike helmets, definitely. Reducing something in your life that causes harm or eliminating, absolutely. Safe injection sites, sex education, commitment to reduce use of substances, therapy, using a helmet for outside activities, alternate coping skills, seat belts, minimizing potential degree of harm, therapy, communication counseling, clean needle dispensaries, a friend to talk to, therapy, meeting people where they're at, therapy. Awesome. Great job. And capitalizing strengths. I like that a lot. So I loved that we talked about practical, tangible, material things that we use, and also therapy and talking with friends and all of these different structural supports that we can put in place as well. These are all super important, and they all factor into harm reduction. So like we said, helmets, condoms, masks, that's been a big one lately. Seat belts certainly came up. Life jackets. We know that life can be inherently dangerous. And unfortunately, we do things that the CDC might not always think is in our best interest. And so we do things to mitigate the harm that we encounter. Now there's some stigma sometimes related with harm reduction. And that really depends a lot on the population that's being served and the harm that's being reduced. So if we look at life jackets or helmets, oftentimes there's not a lot of stigma related to that. If we look at something like a supervised injection facility or a syringe access site or even condom distribution, there's some moral quandaries that appear in our society. We still are very, very tied up in the years of moral and temperance models that we've utilized to explain human behavior. And so that's something just to be a little bit cognizant about as we go forward and talk about harm reduction with substances and why we might feel a little bit more iffy about that than we would any other form of reducing harm we might encounter or utilize. So I have a favorite kind of collection of principles of harm reduction, and these come from the National Harm Reduction Coalition, which we call the mothership here in the United States. And these are not the only principles that exist, but I think that they encapsulate the spirit of harm reduction really well. And so we'll just go through those real quickly. So harm reduction accepts for better or worse that licit and illicit drug use is part of our world and chooses to work to minimize its harmful effects rather than simply ignoring or condemning them. Harm reduction understands drug use as a complex, multifaceted phenomenon that encompasses a continuum of behaviors from severe use to total abstinence and acknowledges that some ways of using drugs are clearly safer than others. Harm reduction establishes quality of individual and community life and well-being, not necessarily cessation of all drug use, as the criteria for successful interventions and policies. Harm reduction calls for the non-judgmental, non-coercive provision of services and resources to people who use drugs and the communities in which they live in order to assist them in reducing attendant harm. Harm reduction ensures that people who use drugs and those with a history of drug use routinely have a real voice in the creation of programs and policies designed to serve them. Harm reduction affirms people who use drugs themselves as the primary agents of reducing the harms of their drug use and seeks to empower people who use drugs to share information and support each other in strategies which meet their actual conditions of use. Harm reduction recognizes that the realities of poverty, class, racism, social isolation, past trauma, sex-based discrimination, and other social inequities affect both people's vulnerability to and capacity for effectively dealing with drug-related harm. And harm reduction does not attempt to minimize or ignore the real and tragic harm and danger that can be associated with illicit drug use. This last one is a pretty common misconception about harm reduction. It is based in reality. It does not ignore the harms. It simply seeks to reduce them and look at the complexities that surround actual substance use. And these principles can be applied to young people in multiple ways, involving them in the programs that we provide, soliciting their feedback, making sure that we're aware of the social determinants of health that could affect their propensity to initiate, sustain, or struggle with substance use. Ooh, we have polls already. Okay, so we are going to have our first little discussion, and this is a fun tool that may seem initially confusing, but what you're going to do is you're going to tell me how you've used harm reduction in your work, and what you can do to share that with me is you can either text me through the instructions on this page, or I'm going to drop the poll link if I can. Maybe I can't. Sorry. Maybe we'll just do the texting. So you're going to go ahead and text Sam Borden 624 to the number 22333 if you're able to. A little message is going to pop up and say, hi, you've entered the chat, and you can put your answer in there. This is going to come up anonymously. So I'm going to give you just a moment to kind of think about how you might have used harm reduction already, and think about the different options we gave: therapy, talking with friends, different tools and strategies that might have already come up in the work that you're doing. Oh, thanks, Gianna. Gianna did post it in the chat if you feel more comfortable utilizing that.
If you do use the link in the chat, you can skip putting your name if you want it to come up anonymous without your name.
Great. Teaching it to others through training. Discussing diet changes and reducing substance use. Great. I'm glad it's working. I was very excited about this.
We have one in the chat too, negotiating a decrease in drug use.
Absolutely. Discussing strategies with patients, encouraging safe rides. Absolutely. Using it on myself to reduce my Diet Coke. Absolutely. Yes. Therapy. Compromising on quantities of drugs and alcohol used. Absolutely. So I'll let you all, oh great, it's part of the curriculum. I love to hear that. Diet education, exercise education, substance use, reduction, safer sex, create, choose one to work on, create a plan with MI, great. Normalizing. So I'll let you all continue to put answers in there, but I definitely want to affirm that these are all great ways to start to integrate harm reduction. Just like harm reduction helps us navigate that continuum of substance use, there is a continuum of harm reduction, right? There's a tool for every step. And so part of this that you are indicating is just having a conversation, having an opportunity for education that eschews, fear-mongering or omits information because of a fear of enabling. We actually know that young people and people in general don't increase certain behaviors because they're educated about them. It actually helps them make more manageable choices for themselves. We see that a lot in safer sex education. So this is great. I'm so glad to hear that you all are already utilizing these practices. All right, so here's a quote that I think just emphasizes kind of where we're coming from today. And that's: the abstinence only mandate puts adults in the unenviable position of having nothing to say to the young people we need most to reach. And those are those who insist on saying maybe, sometimes, or even yes to drugs. And it prevents us from having conversations about how to reduce risks and keep them safe. And so the big thing about harm reduction today is that we're shifting the conversation, especially with young people, from abstinence as the only source of safety to safety as our primary goal, and the different avenues that we can use to get to that point for each person. So we can address substance use and harm reduction along the different stages of adolescence. We know that talking to a 9-year-old about substances is going to look different than talking to a 15-year-old about substances. A big part of understanding how adolescents interact with different risks and benefits is just knowing that that frontal cortex has not completely formed until about the age of 25. However, teenagers are still able to arrive at answers similarly to adults. They think of possible explanations, and importantly, they also test them out. There's a curiosity, there's a desire for experimentation, there's also a desire for autonomy that exists. And these are all really important to our development and our understanding of the world. However, we do want to be aware that young people's reward centers are highly sensitive comparatively, and that because their executive reason is still forming or still developing, their ability to kind of weigh the pros and cons might look different than it does with adults. So providing them with information can be really helpful to kind of facilitate their ability to find out what's best for them. Now, I think it's great to be honest with young people about what substances do, how it interacts with our bodies and our brains, what this conversation might look like for younger students who maybe haven't really been introduced to substances in general. It's just talking about, values. What do you want for yourself? What does it look like when you disagree with the people around you about what you want to do? How do you assert your autonomy? How do you choose the safest route for you? So kind of developing these tools early on so that by the time you start talking about substance use, sexual health, diet, risk-taking, you have this fundamental foundation of, having a conversation about what are some kind of scaffolding principles that young people can use to inform their choices. If we don't provide, even-handed information, if we don't kind of make sure that we're meeting young people where they're at in terms of being realistic about what they know and what they can kind of comprehend, they'll often distrust us. Young people can look at the world around them and differentiate that with the messages that they're receiving. And so we want to make sure that we're not speaking to them in a way that's infantilizing, patronizing, or one-sided, because they likely will catch on pretty quickly. Another aspect that we do look at, kind of speaking of that adolescent brain, is the way that we start to develop neural connections. And so I have some fun pictures on here. I actually have put a couple slides throughout this presentation that I've used in presentations to high school students, and this is one of them. And so in this, we're talking about how when you're really young, your brain is full of neural connections, neural pathways. It's confusing. There is a lot of stimulus around you, and there's a lot of kind of things going on as you absorb the world. As you start to gain some familiarity with your surroundings, you start to understand how things work, you develop, your brain starts pruning away unnecessary connections to make things a little bit easier. And as those pathways get more and more utilized, they myelinate and become strengthened. And so what we also have to understand is that the more likely that, or the more often that a young person chooses to take a neural pathway like using substances, the more likely that pathway will become myelinated. And there's a great deal of sensitivity in the adolescent brain in terms of building those strong connections to the utilization of substances for coping, for mood enhancement. There's been some research to indicate that young people have less of dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter that enhances our sense of well-being. And because that they have that heightened reward center and that lessened executive functioning, they may look at the risks and rewards and they might understand the pros and cons of a behavior, but they might say, this reward, this dopamine rush is actually worth it. It's worth getting on a skateboard and holding on to the bumper of my friend's truck, or it's worth having, 7 shots of alcohol in the basement of my friend's house. They kind of can look at the pros and cons, but they might decide that this is the best choice for them in that moment. Something else that we also have to look at is the impact of trauma on adults and adolescents. We know that not only trauma can also, influence our emotional state, but it also changes our physiology. So if you look at this picture on this slide, you see 2 brains. One is a healthy, pretty standard brain, and the other is the brain of a child that was severely neglected and experienced some trauma early on in life. And so you see that there's this impact on that prefrontal cortex, on many different areas that are really important for managing the way that we function within the world. And we have to be conscious of the impact of these things when we're looking at behaviors. We oftentimes will be really tempted to look at the behaviors, look at the immediately presenting issue and say, this is the problem. But like the quote says, heavy drug use is a symptom at least as often as it is a cause of problems. So we really have to look at these other factors that might be coming into play when we're looking at the reason that a young person is engaging in substance use. So what we usually use as a framework is the biopsychosocial model of substance use. We know now that substance use does not occur in a vacuum. There are a lot of different influential factors when it comes to someone's likelihood to initiate, sustain, or struggle with a substance use disorder. We know that that could be genetics. If you have a parent or a relative who has a substance use disorder, your risk of having a substance use disorder does increase. If your cultural situation or your socioeconomic status or your sense of safety is impacted, that can certainly be an indicator for engaging in substance use. If you have trauma, mental health concerns, these also can be precipitators of substance use. And so we want to be conscious of that when we're looking at ways not only to identify substance use issues, but also to navigate prevention, intervention, and treatment. And so a lot of this is kind of contingent upon looking at protective and risk factors. And we're going to talk about some of the new sort of interventions that are in place to really enhance the building of protective factors, such as caregiver involvement, building up positive norms in schools, so kind of counter indicating or helping students understand that substance use is not as prevalent as they might think it is, building up positive peer relationships, really giving young people a chance to be actively part of this education and prevention in their schools and their other relationship circles. And then also being conscious of the risk factors and making sure that we're trying to balance out appropriately for each student and each population that we're working with. All right, so I have a little fun exercise for you all, and feel free to throw in the chat or say it out loud, but I'm interested, looking at these pictures, what do you see in common with all these pictures? Don't be shy. Yes. Perfect. So alcohol, I like booze. That's a good synonym. Fetishizing alcohol, glorifying alcohol, absolutely. So On the outset, we see this. We see alcohol consumption, we see partying, we see fetishization, if we want to use that kind of language as well. But really, when we look a little bit deeper, every single person that's in the circle is in recovery. And this is important because I think when we look into prevention and education, we often want to frame the world in black and white, right? Especially for young people. With adults, we're a little bit more comfortable about saying, you know, here's the spectrum, here's the risk reduction. But for young people, we are really tempted to say abstinence. They are getting this messaging. They're seeing these people, they're seeing this, you know, kind of glorification of alcohol, but they're not really getting all of the different information about what other people's relationship with substances are. We're not talking about what happens if you do decide to use substances and need help, what it looks like for someone to be in recovery. It's really important to kind of open up these discussions. Peer pressure is often blamed for young people using substance use, and it certainly can be a factor. But young people are exposed to constant messaging about substance use through their family, media, and societal exposure. And alcohol is obviously a very widely accepted part of our culture. And so rather than focusing simply on peer pressure and resisting the influence of friends, we want to also promote connection, explore motivation for people's different behaviors and choices, talk about some of these complexities so that we can give people a pretty full picture of substance use and how they can stay safer and also get support and have role models along the spectrum. So we have certainly gotten better about addressing substance use education over the years, but we do still have some strategy limitations. And again, I want to say, you know, some of the things that I have listed here, I know you all are actively working in a way that kind of improves upon these situations, you know, engaging young people and their voice. So I'm definitely looking forward to having a further discussion about that later on. But certainly a sole focus on prevention has been a limitation for our strategies. Again, you know, just say no works to a point for some students, but there's no explanation, there's no risk reduction after that point. What happens if you use substances? What do we do next? Omission of information is really common. We don't really talk about a substance use continuum with young people, including abstinence. We talk about abstinence, we don't really talk about how to increase safety along the way. We often use scare tactics still. We include misleading information, one-sided information. This is really prevalent in a lot of our PSAs still. We're not doing the fried egg, this is your brain on drugs anymore, but we certainly do have some scary media out there. Again, we do want to let people know that there is some real and serious harm that can come from using substances. But we do want to make sure that we're also giving them information on how to mitigate that harm as well. We are not giving a ton of comprehensive information on how to inform decisions and reduce harms. And it's also framed often in a punitive context. So it's kind of framed around having a conversation with the school resource officer rather than having a conversation with the health center. And we still see more suspensions and expulsions, which actually counteract some of those protective factors that we really want to keep in place for young people to support them in kind of having that separation between substance use as their primary coping mechanism. And we still see a failure to utilize young people's voice. Young people know what works for them, and they are great informants when it comes to building positive prevention programs and social norming campaigns. And so if you're utilizing this strategy, you are on absolutely the right track. So I like to use DARE as a case study of the evolution of some of our prevention practices that we've seen. I mentioned that I was in DARE in the 90s, and I did very well in it because of my very black and white understanding of substances and absolute fear of anything related to them. But really, the Department of Justice found that there was only a short-term reduction in tobacco use from this program and no reduction in alcohol or marijuana use. Yet this was in 1994, and they continued to use the same programming widely across the world until the early 2000s. Around that time, they introduced some prevention scientists into the mix. And these prevention scientists said, we need to focus on social emotional learning. So just like we mentioned before, we're talking about values, building connection, building an autonomy and our ability to make choices for ourselves. And this actually became really, really effective. The campaign name's a little cheesy. It's called Keeping It Real. But it has been found to really help students kind of find a variety of tactics to help them abstain. It's showed reduction in substance use among students who are already using them. And so there's some great things that we're seeing happen when we look at our substance use programs and we modify them to be more evidence-based. The problems that still exist with DARE are that, again, it's still largely enforced or framed by law enforcement. So we still have that punitive aspect. It really reinforces the criminal legal system lens. It is not necessarily trauma informed because of this. And research has found that it can increase positive, feelings about law enforcement for some students, but unsurprisingly, that is variable along, racial and ethnic and socioeconomic lines. And so there's still some room to grow and improve within this program if we do end up retaining it as a primary prevention method. So we have some other great emerging strategies, which I'm sure many of you are already pretty aware of. And these are all strategies that, again, focus on building up those protective factors and risk reduction. And they don't explicitly always use harm reduction in so many words in their descriptions, but they are absolutely utilizing harm reduction practices. So Communities That Care is a practice that helps to build up that community attachment, those protective factors, those educational programs, and it has a very big peer involvement component where young people are involved in the process of reducing substance use and mental health concerns and intervening with their peers. Restorative justice practices have become more and more popular, which is fantastic because it's combating some of that suspension and expulsion that is, again, removing young people from education, extracurriculars, peers that could be really positive forces in their lives in terms of reducing their substance use. We have that social emotional learning, so really getting to know who we are, what we value, how we react to challenges as a basis for how we're going to make choices about our substance use. Positive youth development has been very wonderful in terms of getting young people's voices incorporated into these programs and allowing them to inform what we're doing. And then I put one of my favorite curriculums on the slide. It is not the only one, but Safety First curriculum was built by Drug Policy Alliance. And this is a great education program that gives you step-by-step curriculum on how to have these conversations realistically about substances and provide some of that risk reduction information, that real information about harms, and kind of promote safety through personal responsibility and education. So we'll be providing some links to different age-appropriate resources after this training so that you can look through them and see what's best for you. There is a statewide kind of standard here in Colorado, but there's not necessarily standardized curriculum for each school district. And so it'll really look like what's best for you. And it'll look a lot, different depending upon what your relationship as a school-based health center is with the greater school system. All right, so in terms of the individual level, because we've been talking more about strategies and policies and curriculum, when we're talking to a young person who is not ready to quit or cut down, that's not where they're at, and we're going to meet them where they're at, we're going to provide evidence-based information about substances. We're going to talk about what substances do. What's the difference between a stimulant? What's the difference between a depressant? What are the psychological and physiological effects? We're also going to talk about three very important things: risk, set, and setting. So risk encompasses what you're doing, right? What substance are you using? Have you ever used it before? How much are you using? How often? How are you using it? So kind of encapsulating that. And we're going to look at that with the young person. Then we're going to look at set. And sets means mindset. So we know that your mindset can have an impact on how substances interact with your body. So if you're sad and you're using it to cope, that can have an impact. If you are happy, it can also have an impact. If you are sick because maybe you're having withdrawal, if you have developed this physical dependence, that's also impactful. So we want to kind of look at these factors. And then setting is really important too. Am I with someone I trust? Do I have a plan for safety? Am I driving? Am I somewhere that I have been before? Am I safe? So really kind of exploring these other kind of elements that can go into using the substance and how we can mitigate harm in these different areas. We're also going to want to solicit feedback from the young person. So this will be a great time to weigh pros and cons. That's a tool that we often use when we're not when someone that we're talking to is not really ready for change necessarily. We're also going to provide safety advice. So we want to talk about overdose. We want to talk about opiate overdose, alcohol overdose, stimulant overdose, really how they keep themselves and their friends safe. We're going to talk about driving. We're going to talk about trusted adults who can offer help if situations get out of hand. So really, again, building up the scaffolding for a safer experience. This is another slide that I've used with high school students to kind of illustrate some questions that we want to ask ourselves or ask a student really along that continuum of substance use. So if we're not using or using very rarely, we can ask ourselves, what are my priorities? How do I advocate for myself if I'm abstaining? If we're in that experimental, social, recreational, binging use, we're going to ask, am I safe? What's my mindset? Am I with people I trust? Do I have a plan? So really just kind of exploring these elements that we talked about in terms of mindset setting. And then if we're in that substance use disorder area or our use is getting more chaotic and frequent, how do I get help if I need it? What are my boundaries? And what support do I need? So there are a lot of other questions you can ask and kind of discuss with young people along this continuum, but these are just starting points. They're less targeted in terms of why are you doing this substance? They're more kind of values-based and priority-based and allows them to have that level of autonomy and also integrates really well with motivational interviewing. So there's other ways that you can approach harm reduction with young people without explicitly telling them how to reduce harm with your own words. And so there's certainly materials that you can use like posters. I really like the 10 responsible drinking strategies posters because it moves beyond the do not drink and drive message. It says things like eat, drink water, find a designated driver, avoid drinking games. It gives you all of these different other tactics to use if you are planning to consume alcohol. The Alcohol in Your Developing Brain poster was built for younger audiences. So this is a great way to start introducing young people to their brains and the way that external substances can affect them. You can integrate this with sugar. You can integrate this with caffeine. You can really just start to familiarize them with different kinds of external influences on the way that they feel. There's some additional considerations that we do want to always keep in mind. And again, I'm sure many of you are already very familiar with these. So language really matters. Harm reduction is all about being person-centered, and that's really kind of the general overall spirit that we want to make sure that we're keeping in play with any sort of intervention with young people. Language can let people know how they feel about how you feel about them and how they fit into the world. So we want to make sure that we are moving away from, patronizing language, stigmatizing language. We know especially language about substance use is rooted in caricatures of race, class, and other stereotypes that is incredibly harmful. Language can also reinforce that cycle of isolation and shame. And so we want to make sure that we're really treating that person, that young person, as a person first, and that their substance use is just a part of their life. It's not who they are. It's just something that we are kind of helping them cope with, deal with, or mitigate risk with. That's, a part of their everyday. We definitely want to focus our attention on confidentiality and consent. Young people really emphasize that this is important to them, and that's understandable. We know that these conversations are inherently stigmatizing. There's a lot of fear about telling parents that someone is engaging in substance use. It's great to involve trusted adults when you can, and you can facilitate that, but you do really want to let people know that they are safe having a conversation with you as long as they're not at risk of harming themselves or someone else, or someone else is harming them. We want to allow young people to define their own experiences through those open-ended questions. So we don't want to go in and say, well, you know, are you using drugs because you don't care about yourself? That's going to immediately put them in a box, and they probably will shut down. We want to ask them questions that allow them to kind of explore, even if they don't really know the answer themselves. That'll really help them kind of get a better idea of their boundaries and their priorities. We're going to build our own personal awareness of our biases, and we're going to acknowledge those power dynamics that will always exist. Unfortunately, we can't get rid of them between adults and young people, you know, health professionals and patients. But we really want to make sure that we're moving beyond our own just immediate clinical judgment, and we're utilizing tools like screening and these open-ended questions to dig a little bit deeper into what else might be going on. We're going to also create these opportunities for young people to inform practices. So if you all are using, you know, youth advisory panels or councils, that's a fantastic way to start engaging young people into these resources. You also can use young people's opinions to develop these positive norming campaigns at schools, or really engage that peer-to-peer conversation that really can be very beneficial as an empowerment strategy for young people as well. All right, so I briefly want to touch on recovery, because we will be having a full learning community session on recovery for young people. But I just want to emphasize that, you know, the working definition of recovery in most spheres right now does not include abstinence as the primary defining factor. So in this particular instance, recovery is an individualized, intentional, dynamic, and relational process involving sustained efforts to improve wellness. Now, I talked about being a person in recovery, and my recovery initially was very black and white. What I understand was abstinence was our marker for success. And that works for some people, but it doesn't work for everybody. And sometimes it really doesn't allow us to celebrate those positive changes, that reduction, that effort that might exist without that abstinence. So we really want to emphasize for young people that really any positive change, any move towards enhancing their well-being can be part of the process of recovery. So I also did want to include a couple different blurbs from the Healthy Kids Colorado survey, just to kind of see how we're doing as a state. These are based on schools, not school-based health centers, so they might look a little bit different than what you are necessarily seeing in your own practice. But we do know that there's some areas that we're doing really well, and some areas that we're still needing to grow a little bit. So we do see that we are providing some health education across different age levels, not necessarily at the level that we would like to in every single school situation, but it's certainly getting higher. We are not necessarily screening as often as we would like to, and we're starting to kind of increase more efforts to make that a standard of care, so that we aren't making people rely on their clinical judgment or even just their individual judgment if it's a non-health professional who's doing that assessment. And we really kind of see the ways that our behavioral health best practices are shifting in Colorado as we kind of learn from these prevention scientists, as we learn from the people who are directly affected. So I really encourage you to keep an eye on these. If you're thinking about, you know, how do I engage with my school administration or my school district, to really make sure that we're, you know, looking directly at the areas in which we can grow, because these can be great data points for you. All right, so I know there was a lot packed into a very short amount of time, but I wanted to make sure that we had some time for questions and for discussion. And so I'm going to ask a couple more questions utilizing the tool that we had before. And so I would love to hear some ways that you think you can utilize some of these strategies that we talked about, either the large scale ones or the more direct individual level ones in your personal practice. And Gianna has posted that link in the chat as well, if you feel more comfortable doing that instead of on text. Focusing on improvement, absolutely. So that any positive change mentality. Furthering discussion of what goals the student has. Yes, making it goal-centered for the student instead of your own personal goals or your school's goals. Look into some of the curriculums I mentioned. Yes, absolutely. So and like I said, I will send out some links to areas you can explore for those. Love the idea of the posters. Is there maybe a template for the brain poster? You know, I'm not sure. It's from a campaign called Ask, Listen, Learn, and I will send that link to that website so that you can kind of see what they offer. They do have some awesome videos too for different substances and how they interact with the brain. And unfortunately, I wish they were they made them for older adolescents too, because they're very cute, but might make teens roll their eyes. I like the Just Say Now. Yeah, I love that too. That image was actually created by a student group, Students for Sensible Drug Policy. And it's a really great reframing, I think, of the Just Say No that we all know and feel feelings about. I'd like to start using a set template in my charting to explicitly identify protective factors for that individual patient. Absolutely. And if you're using Just Health, I think that Just Health gives you a lot of extra information about young people that we don't necessarily always know how to use. And so that can be a great way to start kind of knowing what are the risk factors, what are the protective factors that we're seeing in each individual student. And I like all the 10 steps to stay safe. Yeah. I agree. I think that is a great illustration of ways that we can utilize harm reduction on a different scale. You know, a lot of my experience was teaching people how to become safer when using illicit substances. And so that's kind of, I think, what comes to mind when I say, let's talk harm reduction for young people, is we're going to talk about wound care and safer injection. And, you know, in certain extreme cases, that can be the situation, but a lot of times there's harm reduction for every substance and every situation. So yeah, using different interventions is great. Awesome. This is a great list. All right, well, now that we've thought of some strategies, what are some challenges that you anticipate or maybe that you've already encountered with utilizing harm reduction in your practice? Oh, and I just saw in the chat, I love the positive change emphasis, focus on what they're doing well. Yes, we want to make sure that we're strengths-based. Time, absolutely. Parents, absolutely. Absolutely time as well.
Sam, we have a couple in the chat to pushback from parents and law enforcement.
Yes, these are all great. Follow up. Yeah, these are all definitely challenges. I think the biggest challenge is weed. Yes, something we talk about quite a bit. School policy. So to kind of address some of these, I think absolutely time is a huge thing. And so what I would say is, you know, set realistic expectations for yourself. You really, I think the fundamental part of harm reduction is creating a safe space. If you create a safe space, that person is much more likely to return to you when and if they need to. And if you have no other time, you know, sometimes that's a way that you can encourage that. You can also give them, you know, handouts, have those posters available. If parents are a concern or law enforcement, which is absolutely fair and possible, that may be a conversation with the broader school to kind of figure out how we're going to message our philosophy around the information that we're providing. How are we going to provide some evidence to, show the parents that we have their child's best interest in mind? Our goal, all of our goals is safety. It's impossible to imagine, a situation where there wouldn't be pushback. But you can also utilize this on an individual basis. It does not have to be a radical change, right? Follow-up can also be tricky. Oh, I lost you. I'm trying to scroll on here. Just in terms of, how often we see the student, what we're seeing them for the first time that we have these conversations. And so that might involve some communication in terms of, how do we connect between the school-based health center and the school, and if there's an SRO on site, and if there are parents involved, and if there's peer groups, how do we collaborate in a way that allows us to utilize each other so that we are not putting all of our time from one department into this conversation. School norming campaigns, peer groups are also great resources for expanding this work. Weed and other substances, I would say, there are also these kind of hierarchies of risk that we perceive in terms of, young people's perception of substances, adult perceptions of substances. So I want to just make sure that we're also being thoughtful about being even-handed about all of them. So here are the ways this will affect you. Here are the ways people might use it. Here are the ways you can reduce harm. People will not necessarily always stop or reduce using substances because of this education, but it will give them something to think about on their own terms in terms of how they want to proceed and how it fits into their lives. All right, and then sustained motivation in the middle of an already challenging time. Yes. So right now, especially, we've seen variable numbers in terms of substance use with young people. There's less access that's being reported, less opportunities for parties, things like that. However, we have some pretty strong trauma happening collectively. And one of the ways that people cope with trauma is using substances. So again, we want to look at that hierarchy of needs, right? We want to look at a young person's life and talk about what matters most to them and work on that, even if that's not substance use immediately. How can we kind of mitigate their first priority kind of harm, whether it's depression or isolation or stress or being overwhelmed with school, and how will that contribute to helping them make positive changes with their substance use down the line? These are great. So thank you so much for giving me some anonymous feedback. I would also love if you have any questions or comments that you haven't added or discussed yet, please feel free. I'm going to kind of zip my lips for now and give you all a chance to throw some of those out if you have them. It was either very good or very confusing. I can't tell. Well, if you do have questions, please feel free to follow up with us. And we will be following up with that additional information. Buy-in, yes, that's a great addition to that challenge too. Like I mentioned, harm reduction is still considered pretty controversial in relation to substance use, especially with young people. Because we are very, very, very tied to that abstinence model. There is no disagreement at all that abstinence is the best choice for young people. And a lot of young people will choose abstinence, but many young people will not. And a smaller percentage of them will develop a substance use disorder. And so how do we meet all of those students who are beyond the door of no? And provide them with tools on an individual basis if that's more manageable. If you're not getting buy-in for a campaign or to put these posters up in the hallway or in the bathroom, what can you kind of change about your personal approach in terms of creating a person-focused harm reduction environment for students? I think that's the first step because it's a big job. To kind of tackle it all at once. So just kind of making those positive changes for ourselves so that we can help people on a one-on-one basis can be a really beneficial way to start kind of engaging in this work if you haven't already. All right, so Gianna did post a survey in the chat, and we would love for you to take that and give us some feedback. This recording will also be available on YouTube if you want to rewatch it, but we'll stick around and hold tight for any additional questions or comments.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sam. This was amazing. If you don't mind, would you just go to the next slide so that folks can see your contact info?
Oh yeah, of course.
So here is Sam's email and contact information. Feel free to reach out following today's LCS with any other questions, or we'll stay on for another 5 minutes or so to help answer any. And then Sam, if you don't mind just going to the last slide, this is the same post survey link that I added in the chat box. So if everyone could just complete the post survey within the next day or so, that would be wonderful. And like I said, thank you so much, Sam. This was excellent, and we'll stay on a couple minutes for questions.
Thank you, everybody. It's been a pleasure to talk to you all.
Sam, we did have one question, if you could go back to your email, but I will also include Sam on the follow-up email as well.
I will type it in the chat so that you all can see. And it looks like
And I will put the...
And my email is right below that.
Great.
Yeah, feel free to shoot me an email if you have any questions or success stories or anything. I could talk about this stuff all day.
All right. Well, like I said, we'll stay on a couple more minutes for questions, but for those who have to hop off, thank you so much for attending today. We were really excited for this LCS, so thanks again.